Hello, IBond fans, the video you've been asking and waiting for. 5.4% IBonds. That's what you should expect to earn in your first 12-month holding period if you've already bought your IBonds after November 1st, 2022, or if you're planning on buying them before the end of this month, April 2023. This 5.4% IBond rate assumes you're a long-term IBond investor, like we are, and excludes the early withdrawal penalty of the last 3 months' interest if you redeem your IBonds between years 1 and 5. And that's what I'll be talking about in this video. How much you could earn in the first 12 months if you've bought or are planning on buying IBonds between November 2022 and April 2023. Why we're buying $20,000 more of IBonds plus our overall IBond plan, and who should and should not consider buying more IBonds in 2023. Here's how much you could earn in the first 12 months if you've bought or are planning on buying IBonds between November 2022 and April 2023. For the first 6-month holding period, you'd get the current actual annualized IBond rate of 6.89%. divided by 2 because it's just for 6 months. If we assume an initial investment of $10,000, here's the amount of interest earned over the first 6-month holding period. And here's your IBond balance, principal plus interest at the end of the first 6 months. In the second 6-month holding period, here's the expected annualized IBond rate come May 1st. This includes the current 0.4% fixed rate if you've bought or are planning on buying IBonds between November 2022 and April 2023. Remember that the current 0.4% fixed rate stays the same for the 30-year term of an IBond. So here's what the expected annualized IBond rate come May 1st includes. The current fixed rate of 0.4% plus the semi-annual inflation rate times 2, which we now know is 3.38%. plus the inflation adjustment on the fixed rate, or the bump, as many of you IBond oldies know that I call it, of 0.01%. And with a bit of rounding, this gets us to the expected annualized IBond rate for the second 6-month holding period of 3.79%. Let's divide this by 2 because, again, it's just for 6 months. This ending balance after the first 6-month holding period is the beginning balance for your second 6-month holding period because IBond interest is compounded every 6 months. Here's the estimated interest earned over the second 6-month holding period. And here's your projected IBond balance, principal plus interest, at the end of the second 6 months. For an estimated annualized IBond return of 5.4% over the first year. As I mentioned earlier, this assumes you're a long-term IBond investor like we are and excludes the early withdrawal penalty of the last 3 months' interest if you redeem your IBonds between years 1 and 5. 5.4% is okay, but it's not really something to break out the champagne for given where rates are right now on CDs and even more liquid T-bills, money market funds, and some high-yield savings accounts. So, I know some of you have been a bit curious by our decision to add more IBonds in April to our portfolio. So let's talk about that next. As many of the super savers who've been with us for quite some time already know, we bought our first IBonds at an annualized rate of 7.12% with the expectation that we would exit our IBonds, that we would redeem them once inflation falls and IBond rates fall, which appears to be what's happening now based on the latest data. Well, our perspective on IBonds has evolved over time with rising interest rates and ongoing market uncertainty. As I mentioned in an earlier video, for us, IBonds now serve a dual purpose. 1, as a way to inflation-proof a part of our portfolio, and 2, as part of our longer-term and or excess emergency savings. So first, let's talk about IBonds as a way to inflation-proof a part of our portfolio. What if inflation isn't over? Or what if there's another bout of high inflation when we retire or close to retiring? Those are some of the dinner table conversations that have been floating around over the past few months. As I always say, everyone's financial journey is different. Do keep in mind that that's me and my husband Marcus, we're thinking from the perspective of a couple who's in their 40s and 50s with 15 to 20 years runway to retirement and a large part of our brokerage and retirement savings invested in equities, 80 to 90% depending on whether the market's having a bad or a good day. And before the Fed's rapid rate hikes, that number was closer to nearly 100% equities. Those equity investments are what grows our wealth. Because remember, IBonds by design are not a wealth growing investment. As I've also mentioned in earlier videos, that's what the stock market is for, if you have a long-term perspective to investing. IBonds, rather, are a wealth protection tool. And that's the purpose they serve in our portfolio. IBonds protect a part of our wealth. It's certainly not the sexy part of our portfolio, at least not in my mind, but it's the safe part. Because if inflation is not over, or if we have another bout of high inflation when we're nearing or in retirement, our IBonds, that's the part of our portfolio that will not be eaten away by rising prices. Now, let's move on to number 2, IBonds as part of our longer term and or excess emergency savings. Because the other dinner table conversation that's been floating around, and this one since 2021, is what happens if we retire into a down market or a recession? What if stock and or bond prices get pummeled when we need the cash for an emergency or when we want to draw down on our retirement savings? Well, that's again where our IBonds come in, because no matter how bad the market's doing, the principal value of our IBonds will not go down. Of course, that also means that however well the market is doing, the principal value of our IBonds will also not go up, and it will not make us wealthy. But remember, for this part of our portfolio, we are in wealth protection mode, in safety mode, in Jen sleeps better at night mode with our IBonds. Because if we do have a massive emergency, or if we retire into a down market or recession, we'd have the option of first redeeming our IBonds, the principal value of which is not subject to market movements, rather than sell our other investments. And options, in my mind, should be a part of every sound financial plan. And by the way, while we are thinking about this mostly from a retirement perspective, in the bigger context, IBonds as an inflation-protected emergency fund can be used at nearly any age, even if you're not nearing or in retirement. And here's a real-life example. A client of ours, a young professional in her 30s, completely wiped out the emergency savings that she had sitting in her bank account recently due to a series of unfortunate setbacks. At first, she thought her only options were to sell some of the investments in her Roth IRA and pull that money out, or to take out a double-digit APR personal loan. In the end, she didn't have to do either. Instead, she redeemed the IBond she had as part of her excess emergency savings with Treasury Direct. Now, this client did have to pay the early withdrawal penalty of the last 3 months' interest because she hadn't held her IBonds for 5 years yet. But that early withdrawal penalty was less than the loss she would have taken by selling some of her Roth IRA investments in an unfavorable market, and way less than the interest payments on a double-digit APR personal loan. Do keep in mind my emphasis on the words longer term and excess when using IBonds as an emergency savings tool. When I say excess emergency savings, that's savings beyond the basic or starter emergency fund of at least 2 to 3 months of living expenses that should be sitting completely liquid and easily accessible in a bank or credit union account somewhere. And perhaps for you, that basic or starter emergency fund is 6 months or more, depending on your circumstances and preferences. IBonds should generally not be used as a basic or starter emergency fund, and especially not if you know or suspect that you'll be needing that money in the next 12 months, because there is a minimum holding period of 12 months for IBonds, during which time they are illiquid, meaning you cannot redeem them under almost any circumstance. For those of you who've been following our IBond and T-bill journey, we're at the point now where most of our IBonds are liquid. They're redeemable because we've held them for more than 12 months. Of course, we'd still have to pay the early withdrawal penalty on our IBonds if we do dip into them for an emergency because we haven't hit the 5-year mark yet. But that's a hit we're willing to take if it gets to that. By using these IBonds as our longer-term emergency fund, we're able to free up the excess emergency savings that we've been laddering into shorter-term T-bills for whatever investment opportunities may arise in the future, whether that may be in the equity market or in the longer-term bond market when rates go higher. So, our IBond strategy is to keep buying IBonds and building out our inflation-protected emergency savings with them. I already delivered Marcus his IBond gift for this year, so he's maxed out on his IBond limit for 2023. Marcus will deliver me my IBond gift when I tell him about our plan, or if he watches this video before I get to telling him. So, I'll also have maxed out my IBond limit for 2023. This means, though, that we have another $20,000 of liquidity in our IBond emergency fund. And the current plan is that this month, April 2023, we'll buy $5,000 of IBonds via our trust, and sometime in October, another $5,000. And for those of you with a spouse or partner who've already maxed out your IBond purchase limit for 2023 and who have no trust, another way you could do this is to gift your spouse $5,000 of IBonds this month and another $5,000 in October for delivery in a year when your spouse stops buying IBonds. I think most of you are already familiar with how gifting IBonds works, but if you're new to us, then I've linked this IBond Gifting 101 video in the description below. In any case, just like we dollar cost average every month into our retirement savings, we'll be dollar cost averaging into our IBond emergency fund every April around tax time and every October before Halloween. And there's no exact science to the around tax time and before Halloween dates I've chosen. It's just what's easy for me to remember. I know that some of the longer term IBond investors in our community do it this way, while others buy May and November when the IBond rate resets, and still others who just buy everything at the beginning of the year or whenever they have the cash. My personal preference is for buying 2 times a year because it allows us to capture all the fixed rate resets, to hedge a bit, so to say. So if the fixed rate in May ends up higher than the current fixed rate of 0.4%, I get that also. And if the fixed rate in May ends up lower, I still haven't lost the current fixed rate of 0.4%. Now, I did do this analysis for one of our January videos showing that the IBond fixed rate typically tracks the real yield on 10-year TIPS to some extent, albeit with a bit of lag time. For those of you new to TIPS, TIPS are Treasury inflation protected securities. And my prediction at that point in time was that the IBond fixed rate in May would be in positive territory. And I still think that it will be in positive territory. But whether that's 0.2%, 0.4%, or 1% is really not possible to say, especially since the real yield on 10-year TIPS has fallen significantly over the past few weeks as investors fled to the safety of treasuries after the overnight collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. Here's where the real yield on 10-year TIPS was on March 8th, just before SVB blew up. And here's where it is now at the time of this taping. Wowzers. As I told a journalist recently when I was interviewed by Bloomberg for an article, there's all sorts of speculation that the IBond fixed rate tracks X or Y, but the reality is nobody knows, because unlike with the variable rate that changes every 6 months, Treasury Direct does not disclose any information on how the fixed rate is determined, even though it stays the same throughout the 30-year term of an IBond. Perhaps this is by design so that Treasury Direct can give themselves a bit of flexibility in managing their budget. Right, so in addition to the $5,000 we're planning to buy this month and the $5,000 we're planning to buy in October, which I just talked about, we'll be doing the same for Diamond NestEgg because, well, I like the idea of an inflation-protected emergency fund for my business as well. And if the fixed rate does end up knocking me off my chair, then maybe I'll think about gifting Marcus another $10,000 of IBonds. I'll take a wait-and-see approach to this one, though. Now, I did mention earlier that this is the real yield on 10-year TIPS at the time of this taping, and that this real yield on TIPS is, in a nutshell, the fixed rate equivalent for an IBond. For those of you who are wondering why we're buying more IBonds at a fixed rate of 0.4% versus TIPS with a higher real yield, the reason is because we're using IBonds as part of our longer term or excess emergency savings. So the possibility for redemption at face value is important. With IBonds, I know that if I put $10,000 in, I'll get the full $10,000 back anytime after the first year if I have to redeem, in case there's an emergency, plus a bit of interest and less any applicable early withdrawal penalty if I've held those IBonds for less than 5 years. This isn't the case with TIPS, which can only be sold on the secondary market. If I need to sell TIPS in an emergency situation, I'd have to accept whatever price the market is willing to pay at that moment in time. And that price may be at a loss if I'm rush selling during a market downturn, which is when most emergencies seem to happen these days, or if I'm rush selling in a rising interest rate environment like the one we're currently still in. Having said that, if you're looking for just inflation protection and not necessarily an inflation-protected emergency fund like we are, then there is a real case for looking into TIPS, which also offer inflation protection plus a higher real yield at the moment than the current IBond fixed rate of 0.4%. Check out this video here if this is you to learn more about TIPS and the pros and cons of TIPS versus IBonds. I've also linked it in the description below. So basically, if you're like us, you're looking to inflation-proof a part of your portfolio and or build out a stable longer-term emergency fund, then you should consider buying more IBonds in 2023. However, everyone's financial journey is different, and here's who should not consider buying more IBonds in 2023, generally speaking. 1, if you don't have a basic or starter emergency fund of at least 2 to 3 months of living expenses, sitting completely liquid and easily accessible in a bank or credit union somewhere. Everyone's basic or starter emergency fund varies. If you're in or nearing retirement, or if you're the sole breadwinner in your family, your basic or starter emergency fund may be more than 2 to 3 months of living expenses. 2, if you need your IBond money in the next 12 months, remember, the minimum holding period for an IBond is 12 months. You cannot redeem your IBonds before that. 3, if you have high interest debt, such as credit card debt, that you should pay down first. This one's self-explanatory, I think. 4, if you have a company retirement match you haven't maxed out. That company retirement match is your money, a part of your compensation package, so to say. You shouldn't be leaving that money on the table for your employer. 5, if you're a short-term investor looking for higher yields. There are a lot of super savers on this channel who hopped into IBonds when they were at an annualized rate of 7.12% and 9.62%. Basically, for the IBond rate at that time, and not necessarily for the inflation protection feature, which is completely fine. That's how things started for us as well. But if this is you, if you're expecting to redeem your IBonds after 12 months, then T-bills, CDs, and possibly money market funds and some high-yield savings accounts may be the better choice in the current environment, especially when you consider the liquidity factor. Because while this is the estimated annualized IBond return of 5.4% over the first year that I showed you earlier, this number does assume you're a long-term IBond investor like we are, and it excludes the early withdrawal penalty of the last 3 months' interest if you redeem your IBonds between years 1 and 5. If you redeem your IBonds in month 13 and have to pay the early withdrawal penalty of the last 3 months' interest, your estimated annualized IBond return of 5.4% goes down to 4.42%. And practically all the T-bills with a maturity of less than 12 months are paying more than 4.42% at the time of this taping. Plus, you can sell T-bills on the secondary market if you buy them via a brokerage company. Now, the price you get on the secondary market may not necessarily be what you want, depending on market conditions, but at least you can access that money that you put into those T-bills if you absolutely need to, unlike with IBonds in the first year. There are also quite a few 12-month CDs as well as high-yield savings accounts that are paying above 5% at the moment. Just keep in mind that interest earned on CDs and high-yield savings accounts is subject to local, state, and federal income taxes, unlike interest earned on T-bills and IBonds, which is subject to only federal income taxes and not to state and local income taxes. And let's not forget money market funds. Quite a few of the ones at leading brokerage firms like Fidelity, Schwab, and Vanguard currently have 7-day yields in the mid to high 4s. If your priority is more on short-term yield rather than long-term inflation protection, then check out these videos here to learn more about money market funds and the top CDs and high-yield savings accounts right now. For us, we're still holding 2 to 3 months of emergency savings at our FDIC-insured bank. We're laddering 13-week T-bills with our brokerage company until a better investment opportunity comes along. And we're buying more IBonds to build out our inflation-protected emergency fund. What about you? Are you planning on buying more IBonds? And if so, when? Or are you planning on redeeming your IBonds? And if so, also when? And what are you putting your money into next? Drop a comment below and let me and the other super savers know. And for those of you who are planning on buying more IBonds before the end of April, I'd suggest putting in your purchase order a few days before Thursday, April 27th. Orders are typically processed the next business day, meaning that if you put your order in on Thursday, April 27th, it should get processed on Friday, April 28th, and you'll still get the current IBond rate of 6.89%. I usually like to give myself a bit of a buffer in case anything goes wrong, so I'll be buying my IBonds after I finish this video. Remember that if you put your order in on Friday, April 28th, it will get processed in May, and you will get the new IBond rate that Treasury Direct will announce on May 1st. All right, Super Saver, I hope this IBond video was helpful. As always, if you enjoyed this video and learned something new, don't forget to share with those you care about, and of course, hit that thumbs up, and see you again very soon with another brand new wealth building video.